And I was talking to my therapist the other day just about like some tension I was feeling at work. And he said, "Are you still trying to get straight A's on everything?" And that stung because I knew he was right. I thought I'd put that away.
I'm your host, Sha Hurley. Each week, I invite a conscious leader in tech, sales, and beyond to share their inner journey, how they overcome obstacles, how they achieve success while staying true to themselves, and above all, what makes them human beings. I hope those authentic conversations serve as an inspiration for you as you continue your own inner journey of self-discovery, healing, and mastery. Hi, welcome, Newton. So I was very excited since we last chatted because you're one of the leaders I knew at Google, even though I never worked on your team, but I heard a lot of good things about you. So I'm super excited about this conversation today.
Actually, before we go into that, well, first of all, Sha, really good to see you. Second, I'm curious, how did you hear about me?
So, at Google, there are different kind of sub groups. There's, ERG group, there's different well-being stuff going on. So how I heard about you was because, there's a period of time when I was very burned out. I was going through my own mental health issues. So I think you started to openly talk about your mental health challenges. Not many leaders were open enough to talk about their challenges at the time. I think that was also the time when I tried to figure out whether I want to stay on Google or leave Google, because the stress was just a lot. Like it hurts my health. I thought I had a cancer, went through this kind of whole journey of test. So you did some talks. You were, I think, also openly sharing about your own journey. And that was the initial reason. And then the second reason was through some of the other leaders who do, they work with you. And then and Google, we have G2G coaching. So sometimes your name will pop up when people are talking about how shall a good thing is to identify a role model. If you do want to stay on Google, who would you want it to be? Who will be the role model? So we're starting just to look at the leaders within Google. And then you come up, your name come up because I know if I stayed on Google, I want to be that kind of leader who can talk about anything, like taking off the mask, just be authentic. You're one of the leaders that I can just confidently say that you've been doing that from my observation.
So that's the aspiration. Okay. That's really interesting. I meet a lot of people who say, "Oh, I've heard about you," or someone said I should talk to you. And I don't always ask, "How did you find out about me?" So that's really interesting. And it's just validating to hear that that's the reputation that's spreading around Google. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
What's interesting? So recently, I think there's a topic of people start to talk about personal branding a lot, like how one should start to build their personal branding because layoff is happening. And then I think that kind of pushed people to start to talk about personal branding. And I always have this aversion to tactics or strategies to build one's personal branding. Because to me, if you are being you're being authentic. And that's naturally a personal branding. You don't have to take extra effort to do that. But what's your thoughts on that in terms of a personal branding? Have you ever tried those tactics or strategies as a leader?
I think I inadvertently did. I'm kind of a weirdo. And so I think I first started thinking about this in business school, where I heard the term personal brand. This was all the way back in 2007. And I told my friend, I don't really get it. I don't really have a personal brand. And he goes, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't have any talking points. I just kind of show up as is." And so at the time, this is just kind of lists out how I was known. He's like, "Well, you're the social chair who is a break dancer who brews his own beer, and you're unusually short and super jacked." For your listeners, I'm pretty in shape. He's like, "That's your personal brand, and you're super nice and everyone likes you." And so what I realized was, personal brand happens whether you want it to or not. And so it's just a container, and it's always being filled by something, and you can direct it or you can just let it be filled. I think what a lot of people do is they don't know what they want to fill it with. And they might be queuing off the system of how do I progress here? So they're filling it with all the same vanilla that everyone else is. For me, that was always super uncomfortable. And so part of the reason I asked, how did you hear about me at Google? My self-perception is I'm just a guy in t-shirt and sweatpants who's like walking around Google doing what he thinks is the right thing to do. Mm. And before, my personal brand used to be, well, one, like everyone likes Newton. He's really nice. Two, he shows up in meetings and he says what needs to be said. And then three, kind of around the G to G and the facilitation that you were bringing up, he's a really good facilitator. So if he shows up at your meeting, he'll make the meeting go better. And so those things kept coming up. Now, as I started talking about my mental health leave, one thing that I just heard on a podcast, there's a podcast called The Future that I really like. It's hosted by a guy named Chris Do, who he speaks to specifically creatives who are trying to sell their services and how to do that. And he had an expert on storytelling come in. And the way the expert on storytelling put it was, when you're talking about personal brand, it's character over credentials. I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And it's all about your story. And so what inadvertently happened as I started telling my mental health story, the fact that someone's showing up and doing something like that, like dropping their mask, being vulnerable, because it's what the moment is calling us to do, at risk of the reputation, it speaks a lot to character. So that's become my personal brand now. Like that's, I think, some of what reached you is, oh yeah, Newton, he shows up as an authentic, vulnerable leader. And so I've never done it intentionally. I've just kind of shown up as I am and said what I thought needed to be said. And luckily, my parents, they gifted me with really great guidance. And so I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of how I show up.
I love this conversation because I recently, after I left Google and I started to think about, who am I? Like, that's a big question. I started to think about, who am I? But to you, it's almost like it's a natural progression. Like you don't like, it's almost like there's no struggle in terms of like your identity or, your branding or who you are, or am I wrong? Maybe there's some struggle that you encountered on the way.
I think some of it's innate, where it just feels more comfortable to be me. I definitely have let my identity get wrapped up in the roles I play, such as like leader at Google, or, I'm a competitive powerlifter now, or husband and father. Those are the really, really important ones. I have to wonder, I haven't really explored this idea, but if I think about growing up, my older brother, he tried really hard to fit in. And we were, an Asian American family growing up in central Illinois. So it was a largely white community. And I think for him, that was really uncomfortable. And he tried really hard to fit in. And I could just see how hard that was for him. And I wanted to not go through that. And so instead, I kind of owned who I was. Like, I was a band geek. I was in the math club. I wasn't athletic. And so I said, like, yeah, I'm not going to conventionally fit in. I better just own who I am. And it didn't win any popularity contests. I mean, it kind of did, because people liked me because I was authentic. But it was lighter. It was freeing. Like, you don't have to follow society. You can just be as you are. And why would I carry extra baggage if I don't have to?
What's the major difference between fitting and belonging? I think this is a topic that Brené Brown actually talked about for the past few years, but I'm curious about your perspective.
Yeah, I think fitting in, to me, it feels like I see what you wear on the outside, you see what I wear on the outside, and we either cue off one another, or if there's like status or hierarchy between us, I try to cue off of you because you are higher status or higher in the hierarchy. And to me, that's fitting in. Belonging means that we understand each other or see each other at a more intimate level. And I think that's one thing. And then two, we accept each other for who we are, I think. And then there's probably a level of, and we have genuine care for one another and each other's well-being. So it's more like the internal is important versus the external is important. Like, are you connecting via seeing the internal or the external?
It's almost like the fitting in, the way how you described it. There's also labels entangled labels us in terms of our, how we categorize people as you being a male, I'm being a female, and then we play certain roles in certain situation to fit in. But the belonging, I sense there's a lot of internal stuff going on. You talk about the acceptance and being okay with who we are. And then if you can think about it, in the past decades, I don't know how old you are. You look really young, so I'm not going to guess.
I'm almost 45.
You look like in your 20s. I don't want to offend you, but
thank you.
Got an Asian gym. That's a plus side. If you can think about the time that you feel like you're just belonging, like the sense of belonging just so strong, like if you can pinpoint to a moment of life, could you describe that memory to me or to the audience?
I'll talk about just in early June, I was back in Illinois with friends I grew up with. And what brought me back there was that one of my friends, in the last few years, he had lost both his parents. And so when he lost his mom, I said, okay, I'm going to find a time to get out there. And so this was kind of a culmination of that trip. And we, called up all of our other friends that we were close with. And, normally if you go on a vacation with friends, a lot of them will say like, oh, what do you want to do? Let's go sightseeing. Let's go hit up this restaurant. With these friends, all we had to do was we just went to his backyard and we barbecued and we sat and we were just with each other. And there's a kind of deep comfort there, not because like they don't challenge me, but it's more like you've already seen me. The way I put it is like they saw me growing up. They saw me at my most dumbassed. And so they're like, you've already seen me make all the most cringy stumbles I've made in my life so far. I have nothing left to hide from you, and we still love each other. And that felt like deep, deep belonging to me.
That's an interesting story because I can totally imagine people who had a similar experiences sitting there barbecue with friends and feel a sense of loneliness inside of them.
Yes.
Like, how did you get to the point? Like, what's the major differences in terms of like, because to me, it's, I think based on what we talk about, it's really the internal landscape that we're able to tap into, right?
Yeah.
Or not, or maybe there's external factors too that cause the sense of, strong sense of belonging that you feel in that moment.
I don't know that this is how it works, but if I think about, I use the term spiritual health a lot. And the kind of non-secular way I like to describe that is the quality of your connection with yourself, with others, and then something greater that knits you all together. And so if I think about that group and how I show up in that group, I have a lot of work to do to strengthen the connection with myself. Like I'm always trying to explore and understand myself better. But I think at least at a level where I have pretty good self-awareness and I'm comfortable with myself. Like I can genuinely say I love myself. Mm. The connection with each other, I think the people in that group, they could see me at that internal level because we knew each other so well and I could see them. And then there's something that knit us all together. There was all this history and narrative around where we came from, what we went through together, where we're at now, and how we've stayed connected. And so for me, there was this whole container of this bubble of belonging around us that went all the way from, deep inside me to the outer layers. And so if I think about someone who might feel lonely in that, I have to ask, where does that break down? Are you fundamentally, do you feel belonging with yourself? That's one. And if you can't have that, then it's pretty hard to have deep, stable relationships with others. And then if you don't have that, either of those two levels, it's really hard to come up with a narrative that knits you all together that feels like really good and infused with love and meaning.
How did you get to the point where you feel a strong sense of belonging to yourself? Like, you love yourself, you accept yourself, and then you connect to yourself. How did you get to this point?
I remember a time in my 20s when I was really kind of lost and unhappy. I didn't like the career I was in, even though there were great opportunities. I wasn't awesome at it, but I was good enough. I was able to pay my bills, I had friends. I could go out and have fun. And so there was a lot of possibility, but I felt very lost. And I don't know why. I was sitting there just watching TV by myself one day, and this thought crossed my mind. And it was, if there were an exact copy of you here sitting right next to you, would you want to hang out with that person? And I thought, no, actually, that person seems kind of unpleasant and negative and kind of a downer.
Uh-huh.
And so that was one of my ahas of like, oh, crap. Like if you don't want to be around you, how are you showing up with other people? Back to the concept of fitting in. I knew how to fit in. So I think I would hold some of that back, some of that negativity. But then it brought up the question, okay, if you wanted to turn that around, what do you need to do? And I still remember I didn't know what to do. And so I was actually felt ashamed to like sneak into the self-help book section because I think I had a much different mindset at the time where I'm like, oh, if I end up in the self-help section, something must be wrong. I must be mentally weak. And so I like creeped over there and I kind of just grabbed the first book I could find. And I think it was called something like The Purpose for Your Life by a woman named Carol Adrienne, I think. And I don't remember anything from that book except it asked me to consider that everything happens for a reason. And me being at the time an electrical engineer who thought like, no, the universe is chaos and math. Like that was a very hard thing for me to put my head around. But then the next paragraph says, you probably don't believe this. You think it's bullshit. But what I want you to do is go for the next few days, orient your mind around the possibility that everything's happening for a reason. You will see the world differently. And what I found was that once I assumed that, or I tried to assume that, suddenly everything looked like possibility and potential, because you could see like, oh, maybe the universe put this in front of me for a reason. And it was just felt like a better way of living. And so then I started to consider, oh, wait, maybe more of the reality I experience is under my control, and it has more to do with my thoughts than what's happening external to me. And it kind of felt like that moment in the end of, if your listeners have heard or watched the movie The Matrix, where Neo, the hero, he's, trapped in this sophisticated computer simulation, and then his brain finally figures it out and he finds out he can manipulate reality. That's what it felt like. And so suddenly I felt like I had godlike powers where I'm like, wait a minute, I can change my reality. Like I can turn this into a joyful place just with my thoughts. And then from there, you start asking questions. Why am I not choosing to do that all the time? What's getting in the way? And that really set off the journey of kind of inner exploration.
That's an amazing story. And I was thinking about at work, certain times people complain about how it was so hard to feel a sense of belonging. Like I even remember when I first joined Google, I was the only woman on the team with 11 white male. And to be honest, I really had trouble to feel the sense of belonging myself. I tried to fit in, like I tried to behave like one of them, talk like a dude, like, just so they feel like I'm like them. And I didn't like myself. I came back home and I feel exhausted. I had to take off the mask. I'm like, and then I think I behaved like that for over a year. And I forgot who I was. So it took a while for me to even like figure out who I was in the beginning. This journey, like turning inward and finding out a way, or how do you get to a point where you like yourself? I think that's a really worth traveling path. What are some challenges you encountered in that journey, turning inward to connect with yourself or the universe, the source, however you call it?
I think even before I got too deep inward, I had to consider all the ways I hadn't put effort into growing into the person that I could, or I don't want to say should, but the person I could be, mainly because my description of it would be I was languishing in self-pity. I kind of said, okay, I've ended up in this situation and I'm not happy, and everything else around me is causing me to not be happy. And at that point, I had to consider, like, even if that's true, what changes are you willing to make to be happy? Because right now you don't even want to be around yourself. And so that's kind of where it started, was it kind of a hard dose of reality of how I had underserved myself.
And that's an act of self-love, because if you love yourself enough, you would allow yourself to behave in a certain way that would even, trigger more love, instead of just pushing yourself, the core of yourself, the essence of yourself away to just fit in. Right.
Yes. Yeah. I think, when we talk about fitting in versus being who you are, but being conscious of the roles you have to play in the system. So I've talked to various, say, first-time managers who say, I struggle with this transition from I was this person's peer and we were friends. Now I'm their manager. That's a really hard thing to do, because you have to kind of reorient expectations around the relationship. And the way I like to think about that is, we are still friends, but let's be very realistic about, I'm going to play this role as manager. And what's at stake? Like, if I get fired, or I don't help you with your career in the best way possible. And so what I say is, like, yes, I'm your friend. I am also your manager. And if I don't play that role really well, I'm not really serving you. So I'm not really being your friend. And those things may come into conflict, but we know what's at stake.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, if you can both put all your cards on the table and then just be very intentional about how you're showing up in service of those roles you've agreed to play, a lot of the dissonance, resolves itself, because you're on the same page.
Now you mentioned that, this actually happened to me. One of my peers was promoted to be a manager at the time. And I can sense that she had a trouble, like, really playing the role. And I actually had my trouble. I'm like, now she's my manager. Should I just do things differently to make her feel like she's respected? And, we all see her as a manager, but we all have those inner voices going on inside of ourselves. Like, we never really talk about those stuff, but then you can feel the energy underneath the conversation. So I love how you're saying, it's almost like you're encouraging a level of transparency in terms of roles and responsibilities, so we don't guess each other's mind, whether how you think you should behave, or how I should behave.
Or conversely, if you just name that tension you were feeling, to say,
yes,
hey, you're my manager now, I'm not really clear, should I treat you differently? And well, of course you should, but let's talk about, in what ways should I treat you differently, and in what ways should I not treat you differently?
Yeah. And then this is where I think I've been working on a lot of self-sabotaging tendencies. If you heard about this positive intelligence training, I was certified as a coach. So now I have a different lens put on when I'm communicating with the people. And there's one self-sabotaging tendency. It's called people pleasing. So I feel like that sometimes gets in the way when we try to really feel the sense of belonging. Because if we have that people pleasing layer add on to the conversation, it's hard for us to really just be authentic self, because we might constantly think, okay, this conversation, I might think, hey, maybe Newton want to talk about something else. Should I ask a question that he wanted to answer? Or maybe that's, I think it sometimes gets in the way. I'm curious about your experiences, working in the corporate system in tech. Have you ever noticed any self-sabotaging tendencies in terms of getting in the way when you really wanted to find a sense of belonging?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So people pleasing, I have deep people pleaser tendencies. And so I think part of the reason that I burned out and went on mental health leave, and I kind of was able to start to unravel this via the, therapy, journaling, self-reflection that I did while on leave, and it continues today, is I would say yes to a lot of things. And the narrative I was telling myself was, I'm saying yes to this because it is a good opportunity. It's an opportunity to help. It's an opportunity to show up as a leader. But if I dig down, I think where it came from was an emotional need to please, where I would say, okay, I need to find a way to say yes, so this person will be pleased with me. And then I backfilled the rationale in after that. And that's a terrible way to prioritize. Like you end up running yourself into the ground. And it would get even worse with, say, authority figures like my boss. Mm-hmm. And so I think catching that, and actually as I get out and tell my story and just naming it over and over and over, has made me much more aware of that tendency. The other one is I have an achievement orientation, and my narrative around that now is that comes about. Sometimes it's driven by aspiration and like what I really want to do. And sometimes it's from fear of not being enough. And so I try to ask myself the question, let's say I am in a project and it's not going well and I alone can't save it. Mm. I ask myself, if this doesn't go well, what do you fear this will say about you? And when I say, it could be, your external facing reputation, or it could be, what would you say about yourself? Mm-hmm. And that's where I found like there's sometimes I don't love myself unconditionally. Sometimes it's very conditional, like, hey, if you don't achieve this, mm-hmm. like you let us down. So pick it up, get it done.
Where's that coming from? If you can remember the period of time. I have this too. I literally just talked to my husband about this tendency of taking things too personally. Like, in a way, if something fails, I would take responsibility and then that naturally linked to my own doubt, to my own self-worth, mm-hmm. which has been interesting dynamic I've been playing with after Google. Because when I was on Google, literally before we started this conversation, you and I were chatting about self-worth, I feel like the deeper, like the more layers we peel, if you think about it's peeling the onion, the more interesting it gets because we get to know certain part of ourselves that we're not aware of. So mm-hmm. when I was peel the onion about like, what's my self-worth? Why do I want to please people? Why do I want to achieve so much? And I realized certain times when I was a child, I started to build this tendency to please my mom. Because I noticed that when I get to top 3 in school, she would be very happy. If I get to great school, she will be happy. And it was really happy for me to see her smile. So I noticed that tendency started all the way when I was a child. But I'm curious about yours. Like if you can remember, if there's any connection. If there's no connection, that's okay too. I'm just curious.
I'm pretty sure there's a connection with my parents. So I also come from a traditional Asian American upbringing where I'm the youngest of 4 kids. Oh. And so by the time I was getting into the part of school where you're being heavily evaluated and you have homework and grades, I had, siblings who went up before me who largely all got straight A's. I would have their same teachers in the local schools, and then they'd be so happy to see another Cheng kid because they're like, oh, an easy one who's going to get good grades. And they never said that directly, but they did make comments like, oh, yeah, like all your siblings are great. We're so happy to have another one of you. And then my parents, just like your mom, you were saying, they were just so happy when I would get good grades, and then they would challenge me to do even better. And now if I look back and think logically and say, did they ever explicitly say or do anything to say, and if you don't, we won't love you? They never said that. But I think as a kid, those like seeds of fear always come up like, but what happens? Like all my other siblings got straight A's. Everyone loved them for it. What happens if I don't? And it's scary. So you just say like, I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen. I'm going to go get A's.
Yeah. And then the comparison, I'm the only child, so I never get to compare myself to, siblings, but I do have friends and some other friends who get better grades than I did. So, and I feel like that get carried along to the current phase of my life. Sometimes I would look at people around me, look at that, so-and-so who are doing so much better than me. And then I'm mentioning this because I feel like that actually gets in the way when it comes to finding a sense of belonging. Because when I'm around them, when I'm trying to compare myself with them, and that feels such a strong sense of a distance, like, even though I really like my heart and soul really want to connect. But then when I compare, I'm like, oh God, like no, like I need to do better. And then this is a weird, really weird push and pull energy that I carry. I don't know if you ever feel this push and pull energy yourself in work or personal life.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm very aware of it. And so I actively try to fight it, but it's very powerful. So like if I compare some phases of my life, college, you choose a major, you're in a curriculum. And so now while you have some flex of like, you can choose some courses, you're still largely compared to other people on the same path. But I remember, being able to do things like, I took a course on Islam. It would have nothing to do with my major, but just because part of it was, I thought it was interesting. And then second, it almost felt like defiance. I'm like, because I can. Like, we didn't get to do this in high school. I get to choose something. And then I remember when I got out of undergrad and I started working, I just started taking grad school classes on the side in case I wanted to get a master's in electrical engineering. And then at some point I thought, wait, what are you doing? Like, you get to choose everything now. And so instead I started learning hip hop and breakdance.
Oh, wow.
And then fast forward, years later, then I went through business school, and that's also rife with comparison. Then you go into a corporation with like Google with so many high performers and a performance management system, which, you are evaluated in comparison to a ladder and standards again. And I was talking to my therapist the other day just about like some tension I was feeling at work as, stress is really high. And he said, "Are you still trying to get straight A's on everything?" And that stung because I knew he was right. I thought I'd put that away, but I said, yeah, I think I am. And what he said to me that I'm really trying to hold on to now is, you get to choose, like, you can still go for straight A's, but you get to choose what's on the test and you get to choose what's the grade. The dissonance I feel is like, but I get a performance review that affects my paycheck and, my standing in this company. But I have to ask, and by holding on so tightly to that, what are you not reaching for?
What was your answer to that?
I'm still exploring it, but I think there's a few things. I think, my time and energy is finite. So the things that I don't have as much capacity to reach for are, can I be the husband and father I want to be? Can I give enough space for myself so I continue to cultivate this relationship with myself, which is the foundation for everything? Am I pursuing my, even though it pays me nothing, am I pursuing my competitive powerlifting career like the way that I could? And then finally, for conversations like this, where I'm getting out to tell my story and some significant change might be possible, am I pursuing that in a way that, feels right for me in terms of like the overall portfolio of my life? Day to day, I ask that. And then when I have space, I try to take a step back and look at like, okay, I don't like the word balance because I've never found a balance point. And I don't really know anyone else who's found a balance point that doesn't look like they're flat out retired. Like, I still have a lot of go in me. So I'm like, I don't want a balance point. I want a portfolio that I actively manage. And so I look at my portfolio a lot and say, like, does this portfolio contain the right stuff in the right amounts for you right now?
That applies a lot of a sense of agency or responsibilities. You're taking responsibility for your own life. It's challenging in Google or other tech companies because, everything is just so fast. Like when we're just moving so fast, and it's hard to really pause and reflect on, am I really on the right track? What's your strategy, or what do you do to make sure you're on track? You're not falling back to this, state of being where you just like try to get straight A's or like, the older like tendency or pattern.
So a few things. I think, again, like telling my story and having conversations like this, I have to articulate like, what is my aspiration for how I show up in the world? And so, the moment I told you that I'm thinking about my life as a portfolio, I'm instantly now reflecting, like, how does that portfolio look? Like, have you checked recently? Because you're pretty stressed out this week. So I think the ongoing conversations are really helpful. 2, I've had some very open conversations with both my team as well as my boss about the way I try to think about my job. And this is really, really hard, is not that I work for Google, but that I work for Cheng, Google is like the key financial investor in this company of Newton Cheng. And as long as our interests are aligned sufficiently, they will continue to invest. But should our interests diverge, then I should leave or they should fire me. And to me, that feels like actually now I control my life. And so I can say, okay, do I want to put other things in my portfolio aside so that I keep Google's investment in me? Or do I want to put that investment at risk? Kudos to my boss. If he ever hears this, he was open to having this conversation. And then what we could do from there is to say, here's where I think our interests are aligned, at least for the next few years, because I do change, but it takes time. So we can then have that conversation. And then for the things where maybe our interests aren't aligned, but if I take the paycheck, I got to do these things. I'm being intentional about here's the whole package of things that I take in order for Google to keep investing in me. And my boss knows where my heart lies and where it does not.
Yeah. And it's great that you cultivate that relationship with your boss. Not many people have that transparent relationship with their boss, because I've heard people, like I coach people, and then some of the people are like, should I tell my boss this? I'm looking for internal transition. Should I tell my boss that I'm actually looking for another job? And I just feel like a lot of stress come from that kind of fear. Like if I tell my boss this and that, and then my boss might start to look for a backfill or start to look for a replacement of me. How did you cultivate this kind of transparency or relationship with your boss? Or you can just say you got a great boss.
I do have a great boss, and I think there's great things to say on both sides. He is very direct. He never makes me guess about where I stand. And he doesn't just pat me on the back and say, great job. He gives me a lot of constructive feedback, but he also sets expectations of, I'm trying to help you improve. Like, this is not meant to say you are doing a bad job. And so I think he, at least for me, he gives me the necessary level of validation to be able to take that much critical feedback. And so I don't wonder about where I stand with him. On my side, I think over time, especially as I came out of the mental health leave, I know what happens when I don't take full ownership of my life and I don't set clear expectations and boundaries. I don't show up for myself. I don't show up for my family in the way that they need me. So I know what the cost of not having these conversations is. So that is enough to keep me a little bit more disciplined about at least considering, okay, versus just defining myself as a top-notch Google employee and trying to check all the boxes they put in front of me, to take a step back and consider what is right for the company of Newton Cheng and what is the alignment with the, your lead investor, Google.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. I love this conversation. I almost feel like it'll be great to have your manager to join the last piece of the conversation to hear his perspective. Because this kind of relationship is two-way. It's not like, you do certain things, but it has to be certain synergy or energy that's matching. I've been thinking about whether I want to ask you this question or not, but.
Well, you have to ask it now. Okay. This question came from
our last conversation where you're like, Shao, I bring in all the challenging questions. You can say no, you can say, Shao, I need time to think about it, or I don't feel comfortable answering. So essentially the question comes from my recent exploration on anger, rage, irritation that people don't often talk about in the corporate world. I think people suppress those emotions way too much, and that causes a lot of mental health issues. Especially in a certain culture and work, people feel like, good vibe only, bringing positivities only. Let's not talk about anything that's bad. So I'm curious about your perspective on that. But before that, what are the, let's say, 5 things you're so angry about, or you hate so much in Google or in tech or in corporate systems in general? I'm not asking this question to try to get you fired. So just trying to get your, try to understand your perspective, and then it's your own feelings, or your own feelings are all valid. So
I'm trying to think about would I say this is frustrating? Because a lot of these they'll flare up as frustrations, and then I make peace with them because I can also see why it is. So I'm trying to think about the stuff that doesn't necessarily make me angry. It's Like, what are the things where I feel like this is unjust or unjust?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll tell a story from, this is not specific to Google.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be honest, the layoffs that happened, I dropped a lot of F-bombs in a lot of meetings. And at a macro level, I understand why Google made those choices. And so this is where I can kind of see both sides. But the human cost to people who were important to me or are important to me, it was just too in my face. And I was overwhelmed. And I was really angry. And so for probably a solid month, I showed up dropping a lot of F-bombs in meetings and not disengaged, but a lot more terse. And through that process, that's a lot of where I really started to redefine, solidify the way that I define my relationship with Google right now, where the things I'll separate are the wonderful people at Google. During this horrible process of a layoff, they showed up so awesome for one another. That was my experience. Like, there was so much care, both from current Googlers, former Googlers, that I came away with much more respect for the Google community. I could also much more dispassionately see the forces that every business is subject to, and to show that, good intent of people and positive culture can't always supersede that. And so in my mind, I separated those two things, where I have so much more love and care for the Google community. But now I think of Google, the business, as my lead investor.
That shifts the relationship you have with Google.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, that's one. You got 4 more to go. 4 other things you feel angry about.
Okay, 4 more. If I zoom out and look at capitalism, and I do not believe there's any perfect economic system. Like, I have a friend who's a professor of public policy, and they say policy is kind of like plumbing. You do the best you can to design the pipes so that the water, this way, it's like, whether you want to call it resources or time, energy, attention, like, flow to the right places. And then after that, you look for the leaks and you try to repair them. And then when you have to, you rebuild the entire system again. And so as I think about something like capitalism, I think it generates incredible value for so many people in society. I can also see in a system like, a very successful company like a Google or, an Apple or an Amazon, like, this is not specific to Google. There is so much bright and shiny in terms of opportunity, status, power, money. It distracts people from the conversation that I think we're trying to have here, which is, who are you and what do you truly want? And you need your fundamental needs met in society. But I think those questions are at the core of, like, the rich human experience. And so I have to ask, like, is there a way we could do this differently where we don't distract people from that question? And I don't know that makes me angry, but it looks like a big bug in the system that I think we need to challenge. And there are a lot of people, like, as you know, in Google who do challenge that. Mm-hmm. There's actually a book that came out recently from Rainn Wilson, who played Dwight Schrute on the show The Office.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's called Soul Boom, and it calls for a global spiritual revolution. Wow. How we've lost touch with our spirituality, and it's really breathtaking in its scope and its ambition. And I think it really speaks to a lot of what I was just saying, not just for corporations, but more our global culture. And so that's where, I don't know that I'd say I feel anger. It's probably some other feelings like sorrow. I worry for people and their ability to flourish. So that's 2.
We don't have to go through the whole list if you don't have a lot of things to be angry about. I like to push the button. People always say, like, Shah, like, you just get the dark power from people. And then sometimes I hate myself for doing it, but sometimes I'm actually happy because I think that's how we connect. You can't just talk about happy things all the time. So your decision if you want to share more or you want to.
I think one that, again, I don't know that I call it anger. I'll call this one deep frustration. Mm-hmm. And again, not specific to Google, but this is really challenging for me as a people pleaser. As companies do things like layoffs and budget cuts, what was happening before the budget cuts, let's say you were running an operation of a certain size and complexity and it was set up in a certain way, you go through cuts and suddenly, whether it's the resources or the people that were making that operation go, you just have gaps. And because the company is continuing to remake itself in a more streamlined fashion, there's no way to address the gaps. And so today I was just having a really uncomfortable conversation with my team on prioritization, and they were calling out a lot of really valid things around, hey, our inability to prioritize, especially when we feel squeezed for what is core to our jobs versus the nice to haves. What this made me realize is how much of my job satisfaction came from, I think, positive feedback from my team, from them feeling well supported. Mm. And the message I had to give them today and in a lot of this year is all we can do is keep escalating the problems we're having. Mm. But this process is going to continue, and it's going to continue to be painful. And we don't have the agency to solve this alone. And so it's basically, I forget whose quote this was, but I was reading a leadership book where they said leadership is oftentimes it's feeding people disappointment at a rate they can tolerate. Mm. And that's what a lot of this process feels like. And as a people pleaser, it's painful because it feels like nonstop failure, even though you couldn't have made the situation much better in any given scenario.
You know, this reminds me of my reflection after I left Google, because when I was on Google, I thought about leaving Google every single year for the whole 7 years. I thought about leaving Google to become a monk living in the forest.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I know. My husband's like, where am I? You know, what you're going to do with me? And then I realized and Google, the time actually, it was a whole dojo. Like if I really want to take my spiritual practice somewhere, Google or any company will be the right place, because you need that kind of situation. You can't just sit in the mountain, meditate the whole time, right? So I love how you're just bringing that back to your people pleasing tendency. It's almost like that situation gave you an opportunity to work with your people pleasing tendency. And that itself, it's like spiritual practice in the corporate world. Absolutely.
I think that if I flip this around and say like, well, what did you want? And I said, well, I want the opportunity to, really transform culture in the working world so we can better take care of ourselves and each other. I want wonderful people to do that with at a company that still dreams and is aspirational.
Yeah.
And it's really nice to get paid while doing it. And then I asked myself, are you getting that still? I'm like, yeah, actually I am. And so for all the anger and gripes I just brought up, this is the way. Like, everything doesn't always go up and to the right. And so this, as uncomfortable as it is probably more dramatic growth than I've gone through in a long time. And just being in the middle of it is uncomfortable. And that's my gripe.
Yeah, I love this. It's almost like as you're talking, I sense this beautiful thing about non-duality, the suffering, the joy, and what do you want, the purpose and the pain. And then it's if we really dive deeper, like get rid of this mental analysis part, it's all connected. Like we can feel happy without those moments, the little moments. So I have one last question. I know we're running out of time, but you can just maybe one sentence to answer. What do you think makes us human being? I know it's really unfair because that's like a 3-hour conversation. If you can summarize, what do you think makes you a human being?
What makes me a human being? I think although it's gotten better over time, I just continue to be lost and trying to seek love from myself and others. And I don't think that'll ever go away. It'll get better. It'll never go away.
I love that. That connects to my root of Buddhism. The first noble truth is actually everything is suffering. But the fourth noble truth is the love is, there's different ways for us to get back to our essence, our center, which is love. So
yes. I think I try to gain love by giving love, and I'm trying to get better at that and do it in a quote unquote healthier way. But as you just said, life is suffering. And if if I had to define suffering, it's aside from like the really, acute traumatic stuff, it's feeling lost and seeking love that you feel like you don't have.
It's always in there. It's the thing. Sometimes we don't see it, but it's always in there. I think the love is always inside of us. Sometimes we get blinded by our own thought process, our filters, our conditions and shadows. It's a lifelong process. I want to be conscious of our time. Any last words you want to share with audience, people who might be in a similar situation you're in, or trying to find a sense of belonging or self-love?
So 2 things. I think step 1 is find a way to belong to yourself. And then actually step 2, can I give a plug for an e-course a friend released?
Yeah, please.
So the up and coming life coach, he's also a powerlifting coach, which is how I know him. His name's Ross Lepola, and he has a podcast called Project Unchained, but he does an online course called The Belonging Blueprint. And it starts with, how do you build deep level of belonging first with yourself? He's a good friend of mine. He's very wise. He's done so much work on himself. And I think we could all learn a lot from him in terms of belonging with ourselves.
I love that. Could you share the link with me so I can link that in the show notes afterwards, in case people are curious and it needs that kind of additional support?
Yes, happy to do it.
Okay, cool. Well, it was so wonderful, chatting with you. And then I hope my questions are not too tough. But I do think this kind of conversation makes me feel like we're a human being. I'm not talking to an AI or, a technology.
Yeah, I'm an all natural human intelligence. And yeah, I loved the conversation. Thank you for going all those places.
Yeah, I have a tendency to go everywhere, but then I think that's something I'm trying to learn to love and honor. Our brand works differently, and just honor that.
Yeah, let it emerge. I think it was great.
Thanks for listening. If you wanted to co-create transformational journey for yourself or your team, go to xiaohurley.com. Let's connect. And if you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe and share the show with your colleagues and friends. I'll see you next week.